You may have heard the claim that Africa had no writing before colonialism. Whether this claim is made by way of ignorance or to deliberately misguide the public, the accusation is as damaging as it is demonstrably false. In reality, Africa is the home of writing, and as such, home to several of the oldest and most influential written languages known to man. Whether that be the insibidi script of West Africa, the Ge'ez script of East Africa, the ancient meroitic script of the Sudan, or the now globally infamous medu script, commonly known as hieroglyphs or hieratic, of Africa's Nile Valley. Africans have always prized the need to keep records and ledgers both orally, artistically, and by means of the written word.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the King's Monologue, for a video that I have to say has grown immensely when I compare it to where I started. You obviously know the topic because you clicked on it. It's Timbuktu. The Timbuktu manuscripts and books are just mind-blowing and mind-boggling. I want to kind of combine mind-boggling and mind-blowing into a single word. Literally, that's how much this subject set me aback. I literally started this entire process thinking to myself, I'm going to produce a short and it's going to be a 1-minute video, and I'm just going to kind of like squash together the random facts. I'm going to put it out there. And I actually did do that, in fairness to me. But it quickly became apparent as I was producing this video that this topic deserves so much more. And this video, I guess, is my progression towards giving this topic some of the research and the discovery that it actually deserves, because it's an immense topic and it's an immense achievement. I mean, it just blows my mind how significant these manuscripts are and these books are, and the education center of Timbuktu. It's a part of history that can't be ignored. It's a part of history that shouldn't be ignored. It's a part of history that really needs to be taught everywhere. You can't just isolate random Islamic scholars in different places who introduce different things and take Timbuktu out of the equation. You can't take West Africa out of the equation. You can't take the Sahel out of the equation. You can't take Guinea out of the equation, Songhai and Mali. What this showed me is that these African nations played such a pivotal role in terms of our understanding, in terms of the learning that diffused throughout the known world at that time. They're sidelining from historical relevance that leaves us disjointed. It makes me think of the quote by the great Sheikh Anta Diop, who said, "The history of Africa will forever remain suspended in the air until it's connected with ancient Kemet." Well, I will say that the history of Islam, and not only that, but of European education, will forever remain suspended in the air until they give Mali and Songhai the respect that they deserve in terms of the development of what has become the modern education system. Bold words, I know, but I think after you watch this video, you'll see that it's very much backed up by fact. This ridiculous claim that before foreigners came into Africa, Africans didn't know how to read and write. And these really are just stupid, racist claims made by idiots.
In China and the Middle East, as well as Central America, writing was invented. It didn't occur to the people of sub-Saharan Africa to invent writing.
You can see they're idiots, and these people are really driven by a weird erotic hatred. That's the only way I could describe it. These people are really driven by an erotic hatred of everything that's melanated and African. It's bizarre, because if a people were so insignificant in history, then you wouldn't talk about them. It's just, that's what makes sense, isn't it? So if there's the people that were irrelevant in history, I don't talk about them. And I could name a list of nations right now that I don't talk about, but I don't talk about them because they're irrelevant, or at least they're not relevant to the story I'm trying to tell, or they're not relevant to history from the perspective that I'm coming from. And yet you find characters like this who 50 to 60, 70% of their content is degrading black people and degrading Africans. And you have to ask yourself, well, why would you do that? You know, the Shakespearean quote, "Thou doth protest too much," does come to mind. Clearly, you're saying this, but you don't believe it. It sounds like you're trying to convince yourself of something and trying to convince your audience of something you know is not true. Because if it was true, then why would you need to raise this in conversation? We're not a part of the curriculum. They don't teach anything about Africa. Yet you feel the need as a part of your truth-telling channel to reinforce that message that doesn't need reinforcing, because, you know, most people don't even think about it. It tells me that you know that the opposite is true. And actually, it just shows me that you are fearful, but also very much in love with African people. And I worry about you, and I worry about your offspring, to be totally honest with you, if you're like this.
Diodorus Siculus reminds us.
They say also that the Egyptians are colonists sent out by the Ethiopians, Osiris having been the leader of the colony. And the larger part of the customs of the Egyptians are, they hold, Ethiopian, the colonists still preserving their ancient manners. The shapes of their statues and the forms of their letters are Ethiopian, while that which is called sacred is understood only by the priests of the Egyptians, who learn it from their fathers as one of the things which are not divulged, but among the Ethiopians, everyone uses these forms of letters.
These words illustrating that as far back as 2,000 years ago, it was contemporaneously understood that the very gift of writing to Egypt, and by extension, the known world, was an inheritance of Central Africa, handed down to their colony in Egypt. These ancient examples of writing bear testament to a likely unbroken tradition of writing on the African continent.
Diodorus Siculus states with very little uncertainty that the ancient Egyptian writing script, the hieroglyphics, was birthed in Ethiopia. And he says this is something that's supported by what the ancient Egyptians say. And he even says during his time in Ethiopia, which is mainland Africa basically, everyone writes like that in Ethiopia. Whereas in ancient Egypt, it was only reserved for the high priests. So I find that very interesting. So I knew about the indigenous African writing systems, many of which that I mentioned in the video, such as, Ge'ez, in East Africa, the insibidi in West Africa, the meroitic script of the Sudan, and obviously hieroglyphs and hieratic script, of which I've done many videos. And the irony, the irony about those two scripts is that they birthed what is the modern European script, which is the Latin script. So the irony of someone making a video and saying, Africans weren't writing until Europeans introduced it, when the evidence clearly suggests that Europeans weren't writing until Africans introduced it to Europe. The difference is when you say it, it's a gaslight, because it's the opposite of the truth. When I say it's backed up literally by irrefutable evidence. We know that the Latin script descends from the Phoenician abjad and from the hieratic script of ancient Egypt. We know that for a fact. Okay, I've got a video that literally traces you letter by letter.
Did you believe our modern alphabet was created by Romans? Well, that's bull. I should say that's a bull, taken directly from the Egyptian R, which became Semitic Aleph, then the Greek Alpha. B came from Bet, meaning house, which became Beta. But this all started with the Egyptian Het, which also meant house. C was this Egyptian cup. The Etruscans tipped it and broke its handle. The Romans flipped it and were happy. That is until Spurius Carvilius Ruger came along and decided that people weren't saying his name correctly, so he glued the handle back on to make G. D was a hand that they drew questionably in Egyptian hieratic. The Greeks stood this up and voila. E was an African man shouting, hey! The Greeks didn't need a H, so they stripped him to form epsilon or naked E. F was this horned viper that was drawn aggressively and stood up in hieratic. The Greeks made one more letter out of this cute little cerastes they called upsilon. Romans liked upsilon so much, they made 4 letters out of it. Why, you ask? You won't believe my answer. Well, you might. H was originally Het. Yes, the same Het as earlier, but drawn bigger this time and no gap in the wall. This became Het with a bar, before it lost 2 sides and became the Greek's Eta. This simple forearm became the Semitic Yod, which finally became the Greek iota, which we now call I, which we were happy with until an Italian, Gian Giorgio Trissino, decided he wanted to zhuzh up the language a smidge by adding J to the mix. K, put simply, was a tent that Canaanites stood up and anthropomorphized into a hand, allegedly. L, a lion to lavish you with alliteration. The Egyptians simplified this in hieratic to this set of interesting squiggles, which the Phoenicians simplified even more, before the Etruscans set it straight, literally. M was this owl's eyebrows, which somehow reminded the Semites of water, whereas N actually was water, but who needs all those waves? O was an eye, not that kind of eye. A pupil, that became an eye, or ayin according to the Semitic. The Greeks called it omicron. P came from the Semitic P, which became the Grecian pi. This eye of a needle Semitics called koth, that became the Greek kopar, is forever stitched into the fabric of our history as Q. This hieratic symbol became res in Semitic. The Romans gave it an extra leg to differentiate R from P. Strangely enough, it began life as a mouth. S was an Egyptian fishhook that just kept bending until, well, here we are. This Egyptian cross, representing a simple tally mark, became the Semitic tor, but the Greeks transported one stroke upwards to differentiate it from chi, the forefather of modern X. Finally, these two bolts were joined together in Egyptian hieratic to make the Z sound. The Semitics called this same symbol zayin, which the Greeks adopted and modified slightly, giving it the name zeta to rhyme with beta, eta, and theta. Finally, Romans gave it its final form as Z, or Z, if you speak the native Afro-Asiatic English tongue, that is.
If you're enjoying this video and you're finding it informative, then please do not forget to hit the like button. That's the only way people are going to see this video. If you're not subscribed, hit the subscribe and the bell button. And if you think you're subscribed, just have a double check, because my subscribers seem to get actively unsubscribed for some really bizarre reason. But please just make sure that you are subscribed. Help the channel to grow. I'd really appreciate that. So this is something that's not debated. And if we're talking about the Phoenician abjad, we're talking about an Afro-Asiatic language, which Phoenician was, by the way. And that's an Afro-Asiatic script. So we're talking about two sources, African in origin, coming together to make what is the modern day Latin script, from which all modern Western European languages get their writing system from. So without any shadow of a doubt, Africa introduced writing to Europe, and that is traceable. And yet you'll have someone come out with this video and say Africans weren't doing anything until Europeans and Asians introduced it to Africa, and yet the writing scripts in Africa all have an indigenous root. Everything that he's claimed in that video, the opposite is true, which is the wonderful irony of doing what I do. You get to uncover these really fantastic gems.
More recent examples of the excellent literary capabilities of Central Africa are found across the Sahel, where medieval African megacities played home to the largest libraries and universities for nearly half a millennia. Yes, for a period spanning roughly the 11th to the 16th century, these infamous and gargantuan learning districts were found in Djenné and Timbuktu in western Central Africa, taking over from the city of Djenné that was situated in the Songhai. For around 500 years from the 12th to the 16th century, the great Mande city of Timbuktu served as the single largest educational center in the world, complementing the financial power of the Mali Empire and capping what was the golden age of Islam from the very heart of Africa. At the apex of this achievement were millions of expertly crafted academic books and manuscripts that were produced over a 500-year period. Some of these were housed in the 180 educational institutions around the Timbuktu, whilst others were held in the private collections of families in local and surrounding areas. Even more were likely sold to the global Arab-speaking communities of Europe, Africa, and Asia. Thankfully, many of these manuscripts have survived to this day, in spite of repeated attempts by fanatic Islamists and foreign vandals who, even in recent years for inexplicable reasons, still seek to lay them to waste.
Now, in my view, the invasion of Libya has to be one of the biggest war crimes. In fact, it's the biggest war crime that has taken place in modern history, and I would say in the modern era. We haven't seen anything as egregious and as unjust as the invasion of Libya and the assassination of you-know-who. One of the unmentioned targets of the invasion of Libya, I'm certain, was actually northern Mali. In fact, I am pretty much of the impression that there was a deliberate push and an opportunistic attempt at sacking and destroying the books and manuscripts of Timbuktu, which Africa had literally coalesced and formed this massive team around to restore and protect this massive evidence, this proof of African heritage that existed, sitting right there somewhere in a desert in the middle of Western Central Africa, in the middle of the Sahel. You had this undeniable proof of African genius, this undeniable evidence that this world owes African intellectuals a huge debt, and it contradicts everything that we're taught about African capability. And obviously this beauty of the Ajami script unfolding, where we're realizing it's not just Arabic, because that would be one of the things that they fall onto, to say, well, it's not yours, doesn't belong to you, these were just Arab scholars, got nothing to do with the Africans, or the Africans were just, players in this larger Islamic game. But then the Ajami script blowing that entire hope and perspective out of the water, because the Ajami script proving that these were indigenous scholars that were writing not only in their native tongue, but also writing for other African intellectuals. And it just blows everything out of the water in terms of what Africans are capable of achieving. And obviously when people have come up with these fallacious but then exaggerated tales of, African incapability or African illiteracy or African inability to coordinate themselves in the same mental tier as Europeans, when people come up with all of these wild claims and they simply cascade them one after the other, so in the end it's this massive snowball of lies and exaggerations. But then you have the Timbuktu manuscripts contradicting and destroying all of those false claims. I think that this was perhaps something that the West wanted to target, and they saw their opportunity in the fall of Gaddafi to fund mercenaries, because bear in mind the entire Libyan war was funded mercenaries, I should say, to send some of those mercenaries to get rid of another pain in the side. The Timbuktu manuscripts continue to exist in spite of a concerted and continued effort from enemies of Africa to destroy them. They refuse to be destroyed, and they continue to exist. And it's just a wonderful, wonderful thing that we still have them. And I'm so grateful. In fact, I need to really look into how I can support more their upkeep, and actually maybe try and make the journey one day to go and visit them and to talk to some of the people who are responsible for translating some of these great works.
Timbuktu was home to an estimated 700,000 of these books and manuscripts. However, many more were actually produced during this mighty dispensation of African high culture and education. Consider for a moment the human capital required for such an endeavour of scholarship, an endeavour that took place before the invention of the printing press. For this single city to house enough intellectuals and scribes to produce millions of books is in itself a marvel of ingenuity and human achievement that should be celebrated globally. However, as with all great dispensations, the exploits of this mighty centre of education sadly came to an abrupt halt in 1591, when Moroccan invaders took control of Songhai and subsequently invaded Timbuktu, disrupting the political stability and central funding that had allowed scholarship to flourish. Scholars were targeted and most fled the city, taking their knowledge and manuscripts with them. The barbarous occupiers didn't understand or appreciate Timbuktu's intellectual tradition. Following this, Timbuktu saw a steady decline for over 400 years, catalyzed by increasing desertification and the eventual colonization of the entire continent. The exploits and brilliance of this African population of scholars became the stuff of fables. The physical and intellectual riches of this once great city becoming nothing more than a fiction legend. Its very name used as a metaphor for the fabled and the most elusive reaches of the earth.
Isn't it amazing that the fall of Timbuktu once again is linked to the barbarism of outsiders? Isn't that always the case? Africans are constantly being lambasted for our present situation, and people are constantly using a presentist mindset to then back apply that and say, hey, you Africans, you've always been like this. You've always been ruled by despotic leaders. You've always been an impoverished and feeble-minded people, etc., etc., etc. And yet, when we look at the cold, hard evidence, when we look at what we know historically and anthropologically, the reality is when great African nations fall, it's because of the invasion of outside forces who not only want to steal the riches that they have acquired, they will plunge it into chaos in a matter of moments. Once again, going back to what I was talking about, look at what happened in Libya, where that work that, the former ruler was doing alongside the Libyan people, alongside other African rulers, the progress that was made in that nation was out of this world, and then just like that plunged into chaos. And this is what we look at when we look at the history of Timbuktu. An amazing achievement, upheld, sustained, built up, developed by Africans, and in a matter of moments destroyed by outsiders who have no ability, didn't have the mental dexterity to be able to sustain the university and the institutions. In fact, they did the exact opposite and decided to hunt down, to seek to kill those educators. Such was the illiteracy, such was the allergy to progress and philosophy and to understanding that they possess. And the same takes place to this day. I just find that incredibly ironic.
However, in the 1980s, a native Malian librarian and archivist, Abdelkader Haidara, continuing his father's work, began collecting and preserving the priceless manuscripts. His efforts gained international attention, drawing support from organizations like the Ford Foundation and the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. The preservation venture evolved into a truly global endeavor, with African nations playing a crucial role in supporting Haidara's campaign, spearheaded by South Africa, under the leadership of former President Thabo Mbeki, initiating the South Africa-Mali project to aid in preservation, provide funding and raise awareness. Following this, the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library in Minnesota has provided digitization solutions, while institutions like the British Library and the National Library of France have provided expertise in conservation. The rescue mission reached a critical point in 2012 when Islamist militants seized Timbuktu as a result of the NATO invasion of Libya, which caused huge destabilization to the region that most believe was an intentional byproduct of the invasion. Haidara, along with Dr. Stephanie Diakite and a network of local families, orchestrated a daring operation to smuggle thousands of the manuscripts out of the city. They worked in secret, moving the documents by boat, car, and donkey cart to safety in Bamako. This heroic effort was supported by a coalition of international partners. Today, while many manuscripts remain in Bamako due to security concerns, the work continues. Digitization efforts are ongoing, making these texts accessible to scholars worldwide. Conservation work addresses damage from both age and the rescue operation itself. As we speak, plans are being discussed for a new, secure facility in Timbuktu to house the returned manuscripts. This ongoing story of the Timbuktu manuscripts serves as a powerful reminder of the global importance of preserving our shared cultural heritage. In many ways, it's a miracle that in spite of so many attempts at destroying this great African heritage, these manuscripts continue to live on. It's ironic that the only reason we have the Timbuktu manuscripts and even know the university existed is because most of the 350,000 manuscripts that survived were stored in private family collections rather than libraries, and therefore were protected from the European colonial practice of burning down libraries, temples and palaces, and subsequently claiming they never existed. The manuscripts, which were largely assumed to be written exclusively in Arabic, have become widely but falsely associated with Arab scholarship, and the role of Arabia and the Levant is often overstated in retellings of the mighty city. But that's like claiming the University of Cambridge's achievements should be attributed to the ancient Romans because they introduced Christianity to Britain. Mali in those years was never a victim of Arab conquest. Yet, in the case of a Central African achievement, as always, it becomes the defaulted position for those prejudiced against the notions of African brilliance to make the outside contribution, however menial, the focus of the achievement. Thankfully, the claims of widespread external contribution have been largely disproven with the recent rescue of the manuscripts, which uncovered a very interesting discovery, which proves their native African authorship. Historians and linguists have discovered alongside Arabic, many key texts produced by the scribes were actually written in a native adaptation called Ajami.
It does feel like the manuscripts and the books of Timbuktu are it's almost like they're a living spirit, and they have a desire to live. It's like against all odds, they shouldn't exist at this stage, given what's happened in Africa, given the colonial approach of destroying African heritage, any evidence of African advancement, claiming it for themselves or destroying it. The only reason that we have the Timbuktu manuscripts is because they've been kept in the private collections of families. And it's taken the heroic efforts of, Mr. Haidara and co. to get together and to try to amass these, and in the end it's been an amazing effort that has managed to rescue hundreds and thousands of these manuscripts that just simply shouldn't exist. And I love the fact that these manuscripts is like the ancestors are watching over them, and they refuse to die, they refuse to be killed, they refuse to be burned, and they are going to exist, and they are going to survive, and not only survive but imprint themselves upon humanity, imprint themselves upon mankind, and say, no, we exist, we were written by Africans, and there's absolutely nothing that you can do about it. I absolutely love that. And I mentioned earlier about the importance of them being written in a native script. Not that I feel like that was necessary, but it is necessary in today's world, because if they're written in Arabic, even if they're written by Africans, you can already see how the Eurocentrists would spin that. They would say, oh, well, these were just Arabs writing for other Arabs, and Timbuktu was just the location. And the irony of that is, if you look at European nations, of whom I won't mention any names, whose early works were written in Latin, okay? And bear in mind, Latin is in the Mediterranean, and we already had a discussion about where the Latin script came from, Afro-Asiatic, excuse me, and yet they would not have a bar of you ever trying to attempt to say that anything that was produced in many of these Western European nations was anything less than Western European in origin. But the Timbuktu manuscripts also have that Ajami script, which really just put the nail in the coffin about raising any kind of idea that the intellects and the people who were delivering the education and writing the books were not indigenous Africans who were actually educating the rest of the world. It's ironic, the double standard that you'll feel tempted to play, because people even say, well, the Ajami script is still an Arab-based script, and they'll completely forget that they use a Latin lexicon, a Latin-based dictionary, irrespective of you speaking in English. The fact of the matter is, Western Europe has never created its own script, ever. And I find that absolutely hilarious, considering they'll say, you saw in the video earlier, Africans have never managed to do anything without the ingenuity of Europeans and Asians who have brought education to them. And yet, in the case of the very language he's speaking, which is English, it's being written in a Latin script. And the people that he said are the greatest geniuses on the planet have never managed to invent their own script. I mean, isn't that beautiful irony and gaslighting 101 done to the standard? Well done there, sir. The Africans actually have created their own script. And even in this case, where it's written in a Jami script, which is equivalent to someone writing in English using the Latin script, which is what we do on a daily basis, and which is what all of those books that are behind me and behind any other person in a library are written in. This is England's Ajami script, so to speak. It doesn't diminish English genius. It doesn't diminish the mental ability of the English. But yet when Africans do the same, they will try to run that double standard. And it's just really important and appropriate that we nip that kind of ignorance in the bud before it sprouts any more diseased-minded foolishness. The whole idea of secularism wasn't birthed in England until really the 18th/19th century. Before then, everything was Christian. And yet we don't diminish the achievements of inventors, writers, or, we don't just say Leonardo da Vinci was a Christian. You never heard people mention the word Christian. Leonardo da Vinci was a Christian inventor and painter. The rule of Christians. He clearly did everything in a Christian environment, and yet Christianity isn't the focus of his achievements. His achievements, his abilities are the focus of his achievements. And yet, whenever you get an African and they're wearing a turban, or they're situated in North Africa, or they're situated in the Sahel, or they're got any kind of association with Islam, it's like Islam becomes the focus. It can never just be the fact that they exist in an Islamic nation, and perhaps they are Islamic, but that's irrelevant in terms of what they've contributed to society. It's not the focus, and it shouldn't be the focus point. The fact that it's continually made the focus point is this effort to attribute praise for these achievements to the Arabs. It's to export what was produced by Africans and to give it to, Arabs and Islamic people. They do the same thing with the Moors. Anything that's Moorish becomes an Islamic achievement, and it's not the case, because we don't say everything that was Christian that took place in England and France became a Roman achievement. Yet it was the Romans who introduced Christianity. It was the Romans who introduced Catholicism to the Western European world. And yet they don't make everything that England and France done a Roman achievement, because they were the introducers of this kind of thinking and this kind of theology into that part of the world. So it's really important that we make that separation and distinction, because this is a double standard. Irrespective of them being Islamic, they were secular. They had their African characteristics, their African personality. I just love that, that quote by Leo Africanus regarding their dancing and their drinking. You can just feel the bustling celebration and the Africanity of their behavior. And it's the same if you go to modern African Islamic nations. They still retain their signature. Go and see the Hausa in northern Nigeria. Yes, they are very much Islamic, but they are very much Hausa. They are very much Nigerians in their personality, I have Muslims in my family. A lot of people don't know that Yoruba is actually about 50-50. It's about 50% Christian and 50% Islamic. Yoruba is by no means a Christian tribe. It very much is heavily, very much right in the middle. So I've got loads and loads of aunties and uncles who are Islamic. It doesn't stop them from being Nigerians. They're still Nigerian. It doesn't mean that they all eat, shawarmas every weekend. They still eat pounded jam and egusi. They still dress in, Nigerian wear. They still come to the Nigerian parties, dance with Nigerians. You'll get Christians married to Muslims, etc., etc. So you have to understand, within the context of Africa, Africanity tends to supersede I'm not going to say supersede the religion, because people take religion very seriously, but you can't erase what is that African signature, what is that African persona. That will always come through the personality when it comes to Islam or Christianity and how it expresses itself on the African continent.
Ajami was a localized modification that utilized the Arabic script to produce manuscripts in a multitude of local African languages found throughout Central Africa and the Sahel region. These included languages such as Soninka, Bambara, Hausa, Fulani, and Tamashek. Ajami required the inclusion of additional characters for sounds not vocalized in standardized Arabic. This reinforced the known reality that, contrary to modern tropes that fabricate African perpetual servitude, the Manda Kingdom, commonly known as the Kingdom of Mali, was never conquered by or subservient to Arabs during this period. In actuality, the exceptional wealth of Mali upheld many of its Arab-speaking neighbors, as attested by the exploits of Mande emperors Mansa Musa and Sundiata, whose penchant for sojourning and pilgrimages allowed surrounding Arab nations to flourish economically. In this economically dominant environment, Mali became a promoter of Islam throughout Africa and the known world. In reflection of this, the libraries and universities of Timbuktu were very much a product of native Central West African brilliance that, because of their relative wealth and stability, fostered a culture of learning and enlightenment they were willing to share with the Arab Islamic world, and not vice versa. From all of the remaining linguistic evidence, we can begin to paint a picture of the achievement that was the once fabled city of Timbuktu, whose gates seemed to attract only the very best and brightest scholars from Africa and the wider Islamic world. In 1509, Hassan Muhammad al-Wazan al-Zayati, from an aristocratic Islamic family in Iberia, was astonished that a quarter of Timbuktu's population of 100,000 were in fact students who travelled from all across the Islamic world to be educated by Africa's greatest intellects. This made it the largest educational institution in the world at the time, and this had been the case for some 300 years since it was established in the 12th century. A popular Sudanese proverb of the time boldly declared that salt comes from the north, gold from the south, silver from the land of white men, but the word of God and the treasures of wisdom come from Timbuktu.
In many ways, it's really amazing how tropes affect people's thought processes in a way that people digest what they're witnessing. What do I mean when I say this? Well, you have the obvious one, which is the slave trope, or the servitude trope. The idea that blacks were always in a subservient position. And yet in the case of Mali, the opposite is true. Okay, the Islamic world was very much in a subservient position to Mali. Mali was the economic superpower. Mali had the ability. A visit from the Emperor of Mali could change an Islamic nation's fortunes for centuries, as was the case when we had the visit of Mansa Musa to Egypt. And exactly that happened. He changed the economic fortunes of that nation for generations to come. And this was the power that existed in the Sahel region. Yet it's because, once again, of presentism that we find it hard to accept that Mali and the Sahel region, West Central Africans at that moment in time, were a power, were a force. People still try to force this idea of that part of Africa being a source of slaves. And actually, whilst we're on that point, were slaves taken from Western Africa during the time period of Timbuktu and Mali and Songhai? Yes, they were. But they were no more numerous than slaves taken from any other place in the world. In fact, the number one point of slavery, or I should say human trafficking, because that's exactly what it was, humans being trafficked from one part of the globe to the other, was actually Eastern Europe. And they're very aware of that. The very place of the Caucasus region was literally, ground zero for slave abductions or slave purchases to take place. In fact, the human traffic that actually, was moved from the Caucasus region into North Africa was humongous, and actually is a massive contributor to why North Africa looks the way it does today. Such was the numbers of people that were trafficked from Eastern Europe, from the Caucasus mountain regions in kind of Eastern Europe / Western Asia into Africa. And yet they will ignore this at every turn, even though we have the evidence, we have the, not just the anthropological, but we have the literary, it's not a secret. Women and children were born, raised and prepared to be sold. It's not like they were being snatched from their families. Their families were partaking in the transaction.
This is Herodotus. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC, writing about the enumeration of taxes and tributes paid to the Persian kingdom, collected from the lands that it controlled and the lands even far away in the distance. He said that a voluntary contribution was taken by the Colchians, that is the Georgians, and the neighboring tribes between them and the Caucasus. And it consisted of, and still consists of, that is in the 5th century BC, every 4th year, 100 boys and 100 girls. This was before Herodotus could even see the beginnings of it. I should add, Herodotus also mentioned a tribute from the southernmost part of the edges of the Persian world, and that was for people called Ethiopians, and what they owed was gold and ivory. People were not mentioned. So the Black Sea slave trade was the slave trade in the Western world until the 15th century, when the Ottomans captured Constantinople and cut the Black Sea off from Western Europe. At that point, 15th century, the Atlantic slave trade becomes the Western slave trade. Daniel Edward Clark, our Cambridge Don, also located Circassian beauty or Caucasian beauty in the enslaved. The Circassians frequently sell their children to strangers, particularly to Persians and Turkish seraglios. The most beautiful prisoners of both sexes go there. He speaks of one particular Circassian female who was 14, who was conscious of her great beauty, who feared her parents would sell her according to the custom of the country. How much? The women selling generally from 25 to 30 rubles apiece, somewhat less than the price of a horse.
Look all you want through African history and you will never see slavery taking such root in the landscape that people are preparing their daughters and their wives for sale, husbands being part of the transaction. What you'll find in the African context is it always works more like a prisoner of war thing, where one, ethnicity overcomes and overwhelms another and therefore is able to capture and to put to sale. Or perhaps you have a man who is a debtor to another man. This was very common throughout the world, and that man would be sold as a slave. You'd sell your debt off in the form of this man and you'd sell him off as an indentured servant. Those are the things that are very common in Africa. But what you see in Eastern Europe is you see these people were literally being born. It was profitable to have daughters because then you could sell them off. The hope of a man in the Caucasus region of Eastern Europe was to have, many daughters so he could sell them off and make lots of money from some wealthy Islamic African. That literally was the case. This is very much verifiable and researchable. And yet they push this trope, they push this narrative upon Africans where we don't have that. There's no record of slavery taking its hold in Africa to that kind of scale. So it's just ironic that these tropes have attached themselves to us, and it's obviously because of our present position, which people can't seem to get out of their head. The fact that Africans are in this position right now, it just must be our fault. The other trope that I really abhor is the trope of the despotic African ruler. And once again, it's a trope that's taken from modern African leadership. Now, I'm not saying all African leaders are bad. Many actually start off bad and end up being really good. But some are good, but many are bad to begin with. And these are the ones that are normally handpicked. These are the ones that don't belong there. And if I was to mention Ivory Coast and the elected leader being overthrown, and the current leader who's in power being the one that was chosen by France, he actually has a French wife. That is someone who's destined to be a despotic ruler. And those are the kind of leaders you find in power. And then when they do things that are evil, which is what they're supposed to do, which is why they were put in place, Africa is then lambasted for its corrupt rulers. But this ideal of a despotic ruler, and they do this a lot with African leaders, particularly the Kingdom of Mali, because it was very rich and very prominent, and it keeps coming up in conversation. So how can they devalue or discredit what was done? Well, let's not say that the Kingdom of Mali was a rich kingdom. Let's not say the Empire of Mali was a rich and powerful empire. Let's say the king was the richest king, and he was the most powerful ruler. And then let's make him look like some kind of despotic madman who off with your head at any moment where you open your mouth. But everyone else around him, all of the people around him, they're all poor. They're all living in squalor. They're all dirt scratchers. But he lives in a magnificent golden tent and has 50 camels outside and piles of gold that he has got no idea what to do with. Because after he's finished spending it on himself and gorging his big fat African belly, what else is he going to do with all his gold other than just give it to Arabs? Or this is a manipulation of history for them to present Africans in this way. The whole depiction of Mansa Musa being a rich ruler obviously comes from that depiction of him holding a gold which was used in a map that was contemporaneous with him. But the idea of him holding the gold in the map was to show the power of the Kingdom of Mali and the wealth and the riches of the Kingdom of Mali. The Kingdom of Mali, i.e., look what Mali invested in. Where in the world do you have comparable scale to what you saw in Timbuktu? Where else in the world do you have hundreds and thousands of educated professors? I'm talking top educated professors, educating, writing books, the best of the best, situated in a single city. That doesn't happen by accident. That happens by investment. Mali was a rich and powerful empire. Wasn't the result of a single rich despotic king who gave everything to himself. And these are the tropes that tend to play out that don't have any justification or any place in the discourse of African history.
The diversity of languages, Arabic, Songhai, Tamashek, Bambara, in these manuscripts was unique for its time, with no other education centres serving this many languages simultaneously. The Mande people in Mali were world-renowned for their exceeding scholastic brilliance and helped to catalyse Islamic sciences through rigorous academic standards that were clearly present in their institutions. According to Tariq al-Fatash's History of Timbuktu, the city's reputation for scholarship was so great that, when a famed Tunisian professor arrived in town to become a lecturer at Sankore, he realised he didn't qualify and retreated for 14 years to increase his studies in Fez before returning. Indeed, these Africans were renowned for such a high level of academic and scholastic capability that the educational institutions outside of Africa rarely produced academicians that were up to par. In the words of Louis Brenner, West African Muslim intellectuals have shaped the production, dissemination and content of Islamic knowledge in relation to the socio-political contexts in which they lived. According to Thornton, politically speaking, Mali had the same system of governance as other African kingdoms, with local kings serving as sovereigns in their own rights, even though existing within a centralized state and kingship, according to Portuguese travellers of the 15th and 16th century. So in many ways, the role of Islam is somewhat overstated in our evaluation of education in Timbuktu. Joshua Hammer writes that the Islam that took root in Timbuktu was never very strict. Leo Africanus wrote that many residents spend a great part of the night singing and dancing through all the streets of the city. Most of Timbuktu's residents didn't observe the Ramadan fast, consumed alcohol and restricted their observation of Islam to circumcision, which has its roots in West Africa anyway. Whilst they did observe the tradition of going to the mosque for Friday prayers, it was clear that the general population seemed to uphold their localized culture alongside Islam and remained receptive to secular ideas.
One of the things that this entire subject has got me thinking about is how much actually started in Africa. You know, how much of what we call our modern education system actually exists as a result of what took place in Timbuktu over that half a millennia period. How much did the Europeans learn? How much did the Islamic world learn from us? How much did these scholars learn? How much credit is Africa owed? Like I said earlier, it's very unlikely. Islam produced some amazing scholars in different places, some based in Iraq, some based in North Africa, some based out of Andalusia, Southern Europe. Where did these excellent scholars get their education? How many actually were educated in Mali, in Timbuktu, that perhaps we've overlooked or just kind of like glossed over that period or that important part of their life? It really does raise an important area of study for me particularly, and that's to really look into many of these medieval geniuses, many of these medieval scholars and people who invented certain, or who are known to have invented certain systems, and to look under the hood and to see, can we trace or can we see that any point in their biography where perhaps they were educated in Africa? Perhaps some of that learning came from Africa. Perhaps those ideas that we are ascribing and attributing to people outside of Africa belong to Africans. How many of those books that exist in the Islamic world, can some of them be traced to Timbuktu? Are some of them African in origin? Or is it just the case that we're finding it in certain regions? We already know that Timbuktu was exporting books in the hundreds of thousands. Exporting books in the hundreds of thousands. The sale of books created an economy in Mali. So if that's the case, where were these books ending up? And how much of the literature in the Islamic world has its origins right here in Central Africa? I should say right there in Central Africa. I'm in London. But it does make you think. It's an amazing, amazing tale that has so much implication. And just like the work of Haidara has just begun in terms of translating and digitizing and getting the information from these very important books and manuscripts, so too has our work as the next generation of scholars just begun to start attributing and start collecting the evidence so that Mali, so that Central Africa gets the full credit it deserves for the accomplishments that came later, or that came as a result of the education that Africans passed to scholars or passed to people of influence around the world. Africans, if you don't know, I'm Nigerian, and I can speak for most Africans when I say this, we very much have a penchant for education, and I always say these kind of things are ancestral. If you meet a Nigerian without a degree, it's a very peculiar thing. I'll be totally honest with you. And I don't think this is just, obviously there's a part of it which is there is an element of kind of Western idealization, which you cannot discount. But there also is that Africans like to be educated. I, for one, I'm for no reason other than I really want one. I'm very much looking into doing my PhD at the moment. I think it would give more credibility to the work that I do, but also I would enjoy the process. And I think a part of that is ancestral. I think a part of me, irrespective of how flawed the modern education system is, we have an ancestral link to it, because actually before it was corrupted and became what it is today, that pre-colonial academic education system was ours. We created that. We created this education system that they repackaged and resold to us, just like they've done with many of our religions, which I'm not going to go into. But we created these education systems. We created them. And they repackaged them and given them back to us. And we're now going and we're taking and we're getting their degrees and this, that, and the other. Before it was their degrees, they were our degrees. And this, I think, explains why Africans have got this almost love affair, this obsession with, irrespective of where they're situated in the world. You know, my father-in-law has 2 PhDs. I kid you not, 2 PhDs. And I laugh because that's just such a Nigerian thing to have 2 PhDs. And this is the thing. This is exactly how it works in the African world. I think that a lot of that, once again, is ancestral. We can't help that. But now I'm kind of beginning to understand where the ancestral desire comes from. It comes from education was our gift to the world. So it just makes sense that even today we're still asserting ourselves in the educational world, because we always have done. I do have a gut feeling that this entire concept of having widespread literacy, think about the scale of what was taking place in Timbuktu. For them to produce that many scholars of that ilk would require there to be widespread literacy. And once again, this is a direct contradiction to what we're being told about Africa, and actually to what was going on around the world. Because really, if you're looking at the medieval world, or even anything before the very modern era that we're in right now, the only people that could read and write would be the royalty, the priests, and the scribes. Those are the only people who had access to kind of that level of education. Everybody else kind of like, get on with your day job. But here we have Timbuktu, a place where it seems everyone can read and write. And that would need to be the case for them to be able to produce the number of scholars that they were, spitting out. It was crazy, the amount of educated Africans you had in one place. So this idea of widespread literacy, this idea of free education, once again, that we pride ourselves in, does it have its roots in Africa? I think there's a strong argument and a strong case to be made that yes, it does. I just want to take a little bit of my time to thank my Patreons, because I don't give them enough thanks. They do an amazing job in helping to sustain me, particularly for the massive gaps that I have in producing videos like this, to kind of studying and needs to go into these videos, and obviously into writing papers, which I'm doing more of at the moment, which is why my content has slowed down. I'm making very little from YouTube at the moment, and most of my support does come from my Patreon community. So thank you. There will be some credits that will roll towards the end of the video to kind of name my production team individually and my Patreon supporters. But a massive thank you. If you want to be a part of that, please do feel free to click on the Patreon link. It's in the description. I would greatly appreciate it. It does help me to grow the channel and continue doing what I'm doing.
Timbuktu's manuscripts were famed for their aesthetic beauty as much as their subject matter. Scribes utilized a uniquely African calligraphic approach using thick brush strokes known as hausa, as well as a Kufic approach from Persia and a Maghrebi approach using bowl-shaped characters. Calligraphers wrote with pens fashioned from bird quills or shrubs. They also employed a uniquely colorful approach to their manuscripts, which seems to be reflected in West African textiles to this day. This is coupled with the geometric designs that decorated the margins of the text, utilizing fractal patterning that is so important in the region. By the early 16th century, the market for books and manuscripts from Timbuktu became so vast, the city was sustaining paper production markets in the Moroccan city of Fez, which had 472 paper mills, and Venice, Italy, whose prized paper exports carried the Venetian insignia watermark of 3 crescents. This widespread demand for these West African texts in the Islamic world meant that even though Mali was already an economic superpower of the time, their intellectual property, found in the sale of manuscripts, provided huge financial gains for the region. Typical of the caliber of the intellectual personas produced by Timbuktu was the famous scholar Ahmed Baba al-Masufi al-Timbukti, an eccentric polymath born in Arawan. He was known for his brilliant mind and lugubrious appearance. He wore black eyeshadow and dressed in black. He was nicknamed Al-Sudani by his colleagues, a unique pearl of his time. He composed 60 books for the University of Sankor's library, featuring astronomical treatises, commentaries on the Quran, and a vast biographical dictionary of Islamic savants. Ahmed Baba's achievements are very much a microcosm of the broad scholastic academic range of the subjects specialized in Timbuktu. It is clear that amongst other subjects, Timbuktu manuscripts contained advanced algebra, trigonometry, physics, chemistry, astronomy, Greek philosophy, the world's largest Arabic dictionary, spanning 28 volumes, poetry, music, optics, historical analysis, romance literature, recipe and herbal medicine, Tariq al-Sudan's History of Life on the Middle Niger, legal Islamic jurisprudence, astronomy, including the orbits of the planets, elaborate charting of the stars and constellations, spherical trigonometry to calculate lunar and solar orbits, nutritional and therapeutic remedies, botanicals, books on ethics, covering polygamy, money lending and slavery. In short, the academic community of Timbuktu specialized and built curriculums around almost every philosophy, theology, arts and the sciences. The sheer breadth of subject matter far exceeded any contemporaneous educational institution, which were typically clergy-led and focused law, medicine and theology. The Timbuktu approach really formed something close to the foundation of what became our modern educational system. So is it fair to say there is a historical problem with African literacy? Perhaps. From all the evidence, it seems African scholars were way ahead of their time, and perhaps the medieval world was just not ready for that kind of liberalism. Indeed, it was the West African traditions of secular and Islamic literature that ignited the spread of Arab literacy around the continent, helping Arabic to become the most widely spoken language in Africa to this very day, and helping the rest of the world see value in widespread literacy.
Did you enjoy the video? I hope you did. I've very much enjoyed this process, and I think realistically this has to be part one of a series of videos. I'm not saying I'm going to come out with another one immediately, but I'm telling you right now, I'm literally scratching the surface in terms of this subject. It's just so rich and it's so deep, and as you can see, you can probably see the enthusiasm that I'm feeling behind the subject as well. It is massive, and it's been an honor and a pleasure and a privilege, you know, coming after our ancestors and being actually able to, you know, research some of the great things and some of the great achievements that have taken place in Africa in terms of the field of knowledge and education and these institutions. So what can I say? Incredibly happy, incredibly honored. I hope you incredibly enjoyed the video and you hit up the like button and you subscribed if you didn't, and I will see you on the next one. I'm out.